Wendy? You okay? Right. I will first call Minister Wendy Morton to answer the urgent question from Sir Roger Gale. I call Sir Roger Gale, who's participating virtually, who's got 2 minutes. Sir Roger.
The G7 has condemned the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny and has reminded Mr. Putin that he's bound by international obligations to respect human rights. One of those obligations is to the Council of Europe. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe will be discussing the credentials of the Russian Federation. So does my honourable friend agree that a nation that engages in state murder and that imprisons its political opponents and their supporters is in gross breach of the European Convention on Human Rights and has forfeited its right to be a member of an assembly that is founded on the very principles of democracy?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. The UK is appalled by the politically motivated detention of Alexei Navalny on arbitrary charges. As the Foreign Secretary made clear, Mr. Navalny is the victim of a despicable crime, and we call for his immediate and unconditional release. The Foreign Secretary has also condemned the Russian authorities' unacceptable use of violence against peaceful protesters and journalists last weekend, and we have called on the Russian government to respect its international commitments and to release those detained during peaceful demonstrations. The UK has galvanised the international community in condemnation of these deplorable detentions. The UK, as G7 President, issued a G7 Foreign Minister statement on the 26th of January, emphasising our deep concern at these developments and calling on Russia to adhere to its national and international obligations. The UK has led international efforts in response to Mr. Navalny's poisoning in August. We have worked closely with our international partners at the OPCW to urge Russia to uphold its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention. Last December, the UK led a joint statement in the OPCW, supported by 58 states parties, calling for Russia to be held to account. And we have taken robust bilateral action. In October, the UK enforced asset freezes and travel bans on 6 individuals responsible for the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, as well as on 1 Russian organisation. We keep further sanctions designations under constant review, Mr. Speaker. However, it would not be appropriate to comment at this stage on possible future designations, as this could undermine their impact. We carefully consider all options under the relevant sanctions regimes. The UK has been clear in condemning in the strongest possible terms the chemical weapons attack against Mr. Navalny last year. He was the victim of a nerve agent attack, and the UK has called repeatedly for the Russian authorities to investigate and explain the use of a chemical weapon on Russian soil and to declare its Novichok programme to the OPCW. The confirmed use of chemical weapons against opposition figures further undermines democracy and political plurality in Russia. More broadly, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Navalny's detention is a further demonstration of the concerning deterioration in the human rights situation in Russia. We raise this regularly with the Russian government, making clear that Russia must uphold its international human rights responsibilities. I raised this issue myself during my visit to Moscow in November 2020, and our ambassador to Moscow raised Mr. Navalny's case immediately prior to his return to Russia, to underline that the UK was monitoring closely Russia's actions. We condemned the detention of thousands of peaceful protesters and journalists on the 23rd of January, and the Russian government's continued disregard for the fundamental rights of its people to freedom of expression, association and peaceful assembly. The UK has also urged Russia to fulfil its commitments under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights and all of the relevant instruments of the Council of Europe and OSCE, and to guarantee these rights, including the right to freedom of expression to its citizens. The UK's policy towards Russia is clear. We want a different relationship with Russia, but Russia must stop its destabilising behaviour towards the UK and its partners. Russia's pattern of aggressive behaviour undermines its claim that it is a responsible international partner upholding the rules-based international system.
Just going back to Sir Roger, if he wishes to add something. Sir Roger.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker, for that powerful statement. I am concerned because I spoke with the Russian ambassador. He chose to call me this morning, Andrei Kelin, and he made it absolutely plain to me during that call that the Russians regarded Mr. Navalny as a prisoner who had broken his bail conditions and therefore would not be released. And under those circumstances, I have to say that I still regard this as a gross breach of the Convention on Human Rights. And I hope that my honourable friend will do everything in her power to underscore that and to make it plain that this conduct is completely unacceptable.
Just briefly, I would like to come back on that point, Mr. Speaker. And we have been very, very clear. The Foreign Secretary has condemned the Russian authorities' unacceptable use of violence against peaceful protesters, and we really have been leading from the front when it comes to taking action against this situation. And we are absolutely appalled by the politically motivated detention of Alexei Navalny on arbitrary charges.
We now come to Shadow Minister Catherine West with 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the member for North Thanet for his urgent question. Labour colleagues and I unequivocally condemn the shocking but sadly predictable arrest of Mr. Navalny, his wife and the many thousands of brave Russians who took to the streets over the weekend to protest the detention. We welcome the government's own condemnation of Mr. Navalny's arrest and the condemnation by the new administration in the United States. We welcome also the statement from today from the Minister, and also want to emphasise the brutal nature of the police response last weekend. And we understand that there will be further similar protestations this weekend. However, the House is united in this sense of condemnation of the attacks. But we also would like to see action on the Russia report, which of course goes to the heart of the matter, because in the end, warm words in this House will not assist Mr. Navalny in his tireless campaign against corruption. Only the disruption of the corrupt financial networks and the flow of dirty money into the UK will put pressure on the Russian government to change course. In 15 months, not a single one of the 21 recommendations made in the Russia report has been fully implemented. No action on foreign agents, no action on golden visas, and the London laundromat is still very much open for business. The lack of urgency is truly staggering. We cannot continue turning a blind eye to this. 4 brief questions for the Minister. Number 1, will the government today commit to the review and expansion of Magnitsky sanctions to include the corruption heading? Number 2, will the government commit to identifying and sanctioning those implicated in the attempted killing of Mr. Navalny? Number 3, will the government commit to cleaning up the illicit money in UK jurisdictions, including London, identified by both the Russia report and the Panama Papers? And finally, by what date can we, as parliamentarians, expect the government to have implemented the 21 recommendations in the Russia report?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving her support to those actions that we have taken against in respect of the detention of Alexei Navalny. And I've really set out the very clear steps that the UK government has taken, and the Foreign Secretary has really been leading from the front in this regard. When it comes to the Russia report, Mr. Speaker, the government's response to the ISC report on Russia was actually published on the same day as its release, which was on the 21st of July 2020. And let me be absolutely clear that Russia is a top national security priority for the government. We will be introducing new legislation to provide the security services and law enforcement agencies with the tools that they need to tackle the evolving threat of hostile activity by foreign states. This bill will modernise existing offences to deal more effectively with the espionage threat and create new offences to criminalise other harmful activity conducted by and on behalf of states. We continue to step up our activity both domestically and internationally to tackle the issue of illicit finance entering our country. The National Crime Agency has increased the number of investigations into corrupt elites, something which I hope the Honourable Lady will welcome. And we are also reviewing all Tier 1 investor visas granted before the 5th of April 2015.
Let's head to the chair of the Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat. Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's welcome to hear the Minister's condemnation of the attack on Alexei Navalny, whose crime, it appears, is to survive an assassination attempt by the state that now holds him prisoner. Now, this is not the first of these incidents. Litvinenko, Skripal, and now Navalny are three names that speak of Russia's brutality towards its own citizens. When will we see a proper list of the ill-gotten gains that President Putin has stolen off the Russian people over the last 20 years? When will we see a breakdown of his hidden wealth through UK jurisdictions or in areas where the UK has influence, so that the Russian people can know how much money has been stolen off them by this gangster elite, and when it will be held in trust to be returned to them as soon as he is gone?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I think I've set out very clearly the action that we are taking in response to the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, and I've set out very clearly the sanctions that we've put in place against 6 individuals and also against 1 organisation. As to any future sanctions that we may put into place or measures, I think it would be wrong of me, Mr. Speaker, to speculate further at this stage.
Let's head to Scotland, where we're the SNP spokesperson with 1 minute. That is Alan Smith. Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd very warmly congratulate the member for North Thanet on bringing this important issue forward, and I would welcome the Minister's statement as far as it goes. I agree with it and support the measures that she's outlined, and I don't doubt her sincerity in tackling this. I think that's important to put that on the record. But I'll declare an interest as one of the co-litigants in the case that's taking the UK government to court in the High Court over the non-implementation of the recommendations of the Intelligence and Security Committee of this House report into Russian interference. And I think it really does beg a belief that the UK government can say it's been leading from the front on this, when I really don't recognise that description. It staggers me that so few of the recommendations of that report, a credible, serious report, have not gone implemented by this government. And I would urge the Minister to commit to making a further statement on the implementation of those recommendations to the House. I'd also ask her for a reassurance, and I appreciate she won't indulge in speculation, but she does need to be aware that there is considerable support across the House for further Magnitsky sanctions against the individuals, because we all support Mr. Navalny and the protesters across Russia, and they need to be sure that there will be action, not just warm words.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to election interference, one of the issues just raised by the honourable gentleman, the government concluded it is almost certain Russian actors sought to interfere in the 2019 general election through online amplification of illicitly acquired and leaked UK and US trade documents. But as he will, I think, rightly recognises, where a criminal investigation is ongoing, it would be inappropriate of me to comment. Just turning back to the Russia report, perhaps I should just add that not only did we just to reiterate that we published our response on the same day as it was released, that was the 21st of July. Russia is a top national security priority for the government, and we will freeze Russian state assets wherever we have the evidence that they may be used to threaten the life or property of UK nationals or residents.
Let's head to Bosworth with Dr. Luke Evans. Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chemical weapons were used on British soil in Salisbury. Now it appears they've been used on Russian soil. The Foreign Secretary tweeted out on the 18th of January, and I quote, "Rather than persecute Mr. Navalny, Russia should explain how a chemical weapon came to be used on Russian soil." Can I ask, has her department received an answer to this? And more broadly, what is her assessment of the worrying use of chemical weapons in British soil and abroad?
Thank you. This is a really important point that my honourable friend raises, and we've been very, very clear that the use of chemical weapons is an unacceptable breach of international norms, and Russia absolutely must respond fully to the OPCW demand for a transparent investigation and, crucially, explain how a chemical weapon was used against a Russian citizen on Russian soil.
Let's head to Oxford with Leila Moran. Leila Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chelsea Football Club has indeed been in the news this week a lot, though largely not for this. But Alexei Navalny's team have released a list of names drawn up by Navalny just days before his return and arrest, which included Chelsea FC's owner Roman Abramovich and Everton FC's Alisher Usmanov, among those who they believe should be sanctioned. Both individuals were described as key enablers with significant ties and assets in the West. I ask, is the minister taking these allegations seriously, and will she provide assurance that anyone, no matter their wealth or position, would be considered for Magnitsky sanctions?
Mr. Speaker, as I've made clear in terms of Alexei Navalny, we enforced asset freezes and travel bans against 6 individuals and an entity involved with the poisoning and attempted murder of Mr. Navalny on the 15th of October 2020. And we did that under the EU's chemical weapons sanctions regime. But as the Honourable Lady will recognise, try as she might, Mr. Speaker, to ask me or to press me to speculate on further listings. Alas, I'm not going to do that. It would be inappropriate.
Let's head to Sidmouth with Simon Jupp. Simon Jupp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is appalling that Alexei Navalny, the victim of a despicable crime, has been detained by the Russian authorities. His politically motivated arrest provokes further concerns about Russia's respect for the rule of law and human rights. Will the minister join me in calling for his immediate release?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have been absolutely clear, the Foreign Secretary made clear that Mr. Navalny is the victim of a despicable crime, and we call for his immediate and unconditional release. I think it's really important that, Russia must account for itself and account for its activities.
Let's head over to Northern Ireland with Jim Shannon. Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just thank the Minister very much for the firm response and also the strong words that were made to the UQ. We stand alongside the protesters and in particular Alexei Navalny. We value democracy. Russia clearly doesn't. Further to the EDM, which I submitted to this House just yesterday on the treatment of protesters by the Russian police, will the Minister outline if any of those arrested are British citizens and what the status of any British citizens currently is in those areas, and further, what support is available for our own people who are there? Thank you.
Minister.
I'm aware that the Honourable Gentleman takes a keen interest in human rights, as so many on both sides of this chamber do, but we are not aware of any British nationals requiring consular support as a result of detentions during the protests, Mr. Speaker, but we always keep our travel advice under constant review.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is absolutely right to bring this matter to the House. And the very brave Alexei Navalny, whose rights have been trampled underfoot under the Convention of Human Rights, the UN Convention, and so grievously disrespected by a fellow member of the United Nations Security Council. Will the Minister confirm that she is coordinating collective action with our allies on this matter to hold the Russian leadership to account? And will she confirm that through the Magnitsky measures and other ways too, not just Russia's leaders, but other officials who abuse Alexei Navalny's human rights, they too can be held to account in a similar way?
Mr. Speaker, I know this is the issue of sanctions and Magnitsky is something that my honourable friend has taken seriously for some time and championed. When it comes to this particular case of Alexei Navalny, we've been absolutely clear from the start in terms of mobilising the international community, Mr. Speaker. We galvanised the international community in condemnation of these deplorable detentions just with the statement on the 26th of January through our role as G7 President. And in that statement, we emphasised our deep concern at these developments, but we were also very instrumental in leading international efforts in response to his poisoning in August last year, where we worked closely with our international partners at the OPCW to urge Russia to uphold its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention.
Let's head up to Chesterfield with Toby Perkins. Toby Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister's angry condemnation of the Russian regime is unlikely to cause much lost sleep in Moscow, whilst the actions of the British government are so feeble last week, the Foreign Secretary was unable to name a single element of the Russian report that had been fully implemented. What we really need today, don't we, Minister, is not those strong words, but actually promise for actions to get the Russian report fully implemented.
Mr. Speaker, I don't accept what the honourable gentleman is saying. We've been very, very clear. We set out the 6 sanctions against individuals and then an entity involved in the poisoning and attempted murder of Mr. Navalny. We've been very, very clear in our message to Russia that we want to see action, and we also want to see them respond to the OPCW demand for a transparent investigation. But in addition to that, we've been very, very clear when it comes to the NSC report of last year. The day that it was issued, the UK government issued a response, and we've set out the actions that we will be taking in terms of introducing new legislation. We've increased the number of investigations through the National Crime Agency into corrupt elites, and we're reviewing all Tier 1 investor visas granted before the 5th of April 2015.
Dr. Leopold.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian regime murders its opponents abroad. It poisons its challengers at home. It still has armed forces on the sovereign territory of the Ukraine and Georgia. It believes in the Soviet concept of a near abroad and presents a clear threat to continental Europe's security. Does my honourable friend have a message for those in Europe who still support the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which will make Europe more dependent on Russian gas and give economic comfort to Putin's gangster regime?
Mr. Speaker, the UK remains concerned about the impact that Nord Stream 2 will have on European energy security, and particularly on the interests of Ukraine. Our focus continues to be supporting resilient European energy markets, including measures that strengthen and diversify gas supply and competition. Obviously, this is a matter for Germany, but we do remain concerned, I can assure him, about the impact of Nord Stream 2 on European energy security.
Mr. Speaker, there are some on the Tory benches who are openly rejoicing at the prospect of Brexit allowing deregulation of financial and investment markets. So, given the massive flows of capital between Russian oligarchs and the City of London, how will the government ensure that Russian officials responsible for human rights abuses are not allowed to profit in this way, and that there will be no diluting of standards and regulations that would get in the way of applying Magnitsky-style sanctions?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to what is the UK doing to tackle illicit finance and dirty money, I can assure the honourable gentleman that we continue to step up our activity, both domestically and internationally, to tackle illicit finance entering our country. The National Crime Agency has increased the number of investigations into corrupt elites, and in the Criminal Finances Act 2017 we introduced a number of instruments that are being used to tackle illicit finance, including unexplained wealth orders.
I said to Newbury with Laura Farris. Laura Farris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Biden administration has already made clear it's going to take a more robust line with Russia, and the subject of Russia's treatment of the Ukraine and also Mr. Navalny's arrest were discussed by President Biden and President Putin during a call earlier this week. Can my honourable friend confirm what joint steps she thinks the US and the UK can take together, and also whether the Foreign Secretary has yet had an opportunity to speak to Mr. Blinken at the State Department?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've already demonstrated the way in which the UK has been leading the international effort when it comes to the issue of Alexei Navalny through the OPCW and also through the G7 statement of the 26th of January. When it comes to the US, our Prime Minister spoke with President Biden on the 23rd of January, and the Foreign Secretary spoke with the new US National Security Advisor on the 22nd of January, and during both calls, Mr. Speaker, they agreed on the need to work together on shared foreign and security priorities such as Russia.
Let's head to South Wales with Ruth Jones. Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many people across Newport West and our country commend Mr. Navalny and his supporters for their extraordinary bravery in standing up against this corrupt and repressive government in Moscow. So will the Minister show the same bravery and set out in clear terms what action this government with international partners will take to demand their immediate release?
Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary has made absolutely clear that Mr. Navalny is the victim of a despicable crime, and we call and will continue to call for his immediate and conditional release. The Foreign Secretary has also condemned the Russian authorities' an unacceptable use of violence against peaceful protesters and journalists, which I'm sure many of her constituents, like mine, have seen it in the media. And we have called on the Russian government to respect its international commitments and release those who have been detained during peaceful demonstrations.
We now go to Stoke-on-Trent with Jack Brereton. Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK, supported by 58 countries, led the joint statement in December calling for Russia to be held to account for what it does. So will my right honourable friend join me in asking the whole House to support and commend the leading role the UK is taking in these efforts, sending a very clear message to the Russian government?
My honourable friend makes a very, very important point here about the need for, a joined-up approach and his support for an international effort against in tackling this issue, and he's right to recognise that the UK did indeed lead the effort in respect to the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, and we did lead that joint statement in the OPCW, which was supported by no less than 58 state parties who were all calling for Russia to be held to account.
Let's head to Devon with Ben Bradshaw. Ben Bradshaw.
Isn't the reason that the government has failed to implement a single one of the now 15-month-old Russia report and failed to apply Magnitsky sanctions against the 8 individuals Alexei Navalny himself has requested the UK government to do so, a simple one, that London is awash with dirty Russian money, as is the Conservative Party?
Mr. Speaker, I do not accept the assertion made by the right honourable gentleman. The Russia report, as he refers to, the ISC Russia report, was released on the 21st of July, and we, the government, responded on the very same day to that. And we've set out very clearly what our response is, and that Russia remains a top national security priority for the government. When it comes to sanctions, Mr. Speaker, we have issued sanctions against 6 individuals and 1 organisation in relation to Alexei Navalny, and as I think I've made very, very clear, we would not speculate on who else we may or may not sanction.
Let's head to Essex with Sir Bernard Jenkins. Sir Bernard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I thank my right honourable friend for her statement, but isn't it clear the lesson is of the last few years watching Russia is that neither Russia nor China, for that matter, have any respect for an adversary unless it can show strength. And what do all our words of condemnation mean without much more comprehensive action? So when is the Integrated Defence and Security Review going to be published? And will it address the role of the City of London in looted Russian money? And what are we doing to strengthen all our alliances to bring the free world together against both Russia's internal and external aggression?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been very clear that what our policy is towards Russia, and that we want a very different relationship with Russia. And Russia must stop its destabilising behaviour towards the UK and its partners. And while this continues, there can be no normalisation of our bilateral relationship. We'll continue to support human rights in Russia and those who seek to defend them. In my honourable friend's attempts to draw me on the integrated review, I'm sure he knows me better than to think I would speculate on when that may be published.
Let's head to the member for Huddersfield, Boris Sherman. Boris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the Minister that as a long-standing Member of Parliament, I don't know what the government's policy is towards Russia. A corrupt regime that poisons people in our country, poisons its democratic citizens in other parts of the world. Isn't it about time that we took on the fact there is a Russian elite in London in control of money, in property, that come in private jets with no hindrance? Isn't it about time we took them on, and then the leaders, and particularly Putin, will listen to what we say?
Mr. Speaker, I think I've been very, very clear that when it comes to the case of Alexei Navalny, we've been very, very clear in what our action has been. We took the lead on the OPCW in terms of signing member states up to demand that Russia follows up with a transparent investigation. We led the way with the G7 statement yesterday. So, and in addition to that, there are 6 sanctions against individuals and 1 organisation that we have put in place. So we have been leading from the front when it comes to the case of Alexei Navalny, and when it comes to Russia, I've been very, very clear that what our policy to Russia is clear. We want a different relationship with Russia, and there can be no normalisation in our bilateral relationship until their pattern of aggressive behaviour changes.
Let's head up to Nottingham with Ruth Edwards. Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my honourable friend agree with me that Russia should only continue to be allowed a seat at the table of international partnerships if it ceases its malign activities?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, we've been very, very clear when it comes to Russia, when it comes to Russian behaviour, what our expectations are. When it comes to the case of Alexei Navalny, Russia must fully respond to the OPCW demands for a transparent investigation and explain how a chemical weapon came to be used against a Russian citizen on Russian soil. And Russia must start to account for itself.
Let's head to Barking with Dame Margaret Hodge. Dame Margaret.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The best way in which we can show our support for Alexei Navalny is not by words, but by actions, not by investigations, but by convictions. Navalny himself has said that he wants the international community to use sanctions against complicit Russian kleptocrats who live outside Russia. He has named Abramovich and Usmanov, both of whom have considerable wealth, property, and links to English football clubs. But on Facebook, Navalny has said that the sanctions haven't worked because, and I quote, the West has refrained from sanctioning the people with the money. Is that true?
Mr. Speaker, sanctions send a clear message to those responsible that the use of chemical weapons is an egregious violation of the international obligations that we must all uphold to keep societies safe. And we continue to work and protect human rights and civil society in Russia. We are considering all options for further action, but as I have previously said, Mr. Speaker, it would be inappropriate, and I'm sure the Right Honourable Lady is aware of that. It would be inappropriate for me to speculate on any future listings.
Let's head to the High Peak with Robert Largan. Robert Largan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The arrest of Mr. Navalny is a disgraceful act by a Putin regime that is clearly terrified of being held to account by the Russian people. Last year, when Mr. Navalny was poisoned, the government took steps to freeze assets of senior figures in the Russian government. Can the minister confirm whether further asset freezes, both of individuals and organisations, are an option the UK is prepared to consider this time?
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to sanctions, we continue to look at this matter. We continue to work and protect and promote human rights, and we are considering all options for further actions. However, it would be inappropriate to speculate on future listings.
Let's head up to Scotland with Stuart Malcolm MacDonald. Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister says that she is appalled by what's happened to Mr. Navalny. She describes the event as despicable. She then goes on to pray and aid the United Kingdom's current G7 presidency as, quote, leading from the front on Russia, and has galvanised the international community. Mr. Speaker, it's a fact. You only have to listen to what members have said in this statement so far, that it's not the international community that the government needs to galvanise, but it needs to galvanise itself, because they won't be trembling in Moscow at anything the minister, who I do like, has had to say this afternoon. And there certainly won't be any winds of relief in Mr. Navalny's prison cell by what she said this afternoon. I don't want her to speculate. I want her to do something. I want her to implement the full recommendations of the ISC report. She owes this House and those protesting in Russia at the weekend an explanation as to why the government flatly refuses to do so.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've made very, very clear, and I think the honourable gentleman quotes my own words, that the UK, so I'll re-quote them, Mr. Speaker, the UK has galvanised the international community in condemnation of these deplorable detentions. And we as G7 President, issued a G7 Foreign Minister statement on the 26th of January. When it comes back to the issue of the Russia report, as I have set out very, very clearly, Russia is a top national security priority for the government, Mr. Speaker. We will be introducing new legislation. I've made that very clear. The National Crime Agency has increased the number of investigations into corrupt elites, and we're also reviewing all Tier 1 investor visas granted before the 5th of April 2015.
Let's head to William with Deshrat Ghani. Deshrat Ghani.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the Minister that Russia is a destabilising force with little regard for human rights and international law, and that, of course, impacts us, especially as Russia continues to use its veto to stall the United Nations in investigating genocide. Does the Minister agree with the government's position that the determination of genocide falls to international courts, but when they are in paralysis with countries like Russia having a hold over them, that the obligation to investigate and prevent a genocide falls to domestic courts?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to the issue of Russia and this particular UQ, this is very much about the issue of Navalny and the action that the UK has been taking. I've been very, very clear in the way that we approach this and set out that we absolutely condemn the action, and we call for an immediate release of Navalny.
24 withdrawn, so we go to Sir Edward. Sir Edward Lee.
I support everything the Minister has said in her condemnation of the Putin regime in relation to Mr. Navalny and her balanced approach. Ever since I married my Russian Orthodox wife, I've tried to understand Russia and the sensitivities of the Russian people. So can she make clear that whilst we condemn the Putin regime, there will be nothing Russophobe about our attitude? And this means understanding Russian cultural and historical sensitivities. And in terms of the Council of Europe, sometimes engagement with Russian parliamentarians may be useful. As Winston Churchill said, jaw is better than war.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable gentleman makes a very, very important point, and I have set out today that the fact that we do not that we want a different relationship with Russia, but I absolutely accept that in many cases there are people-to-people links, which are something entirely different. And when it comes to culture, there are many links between our two countries. But let's be absolutely clear that Russia's pattern of aggressive behaviour undermines its claim that it's a responsible international partner upholding the rules-based international system. And we, the UK, will continue to support human rights in Russia and those who seek to defend them.
I've suspended the House for 3 minutes to enable the necessary arrangements for the next business to be made. Order. Yeah. Come on, Bob. Come on, David, go and grab a seat. When you're ready, we'll start. Order! I call the Prime Minister to make a statement. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'll make a statement on the government's measures to safeguard our United Kingdom against the new variants of COVID, until we've administered enough vaccinations to free ourselves from the virus. And I'm acutely conscious that at this moment, parents are balancing the demands of working from home with supporting the education of their children. Business people are enduring the sight of their shops or restaurants or other enterprises standing empty and idle, and sadly, too many are coping with the anxiety of illness or the tragedy of bereavement. And I'm deeply sorry to say that the number of people that have been taken from us has surpassed 100,000, as the House was discussing only an hour or so ago. And I know that the House will join me in offering condolences to all those who have lost loved ones. The most important thing we can do to honour their memory is to persevere against this virus with ever greater resolve, and that's why we've launched the biggest vaccination programme in British history. 3 weeks ago I reported that the UK had immunised 1.3 million people. Now that figure has multiplied more than fivefold to exceed 6.8 million people, more than any other country in Europe, and over 13% of the entire adult population. In England, we've now delivered first doses to over 4/5 of those aged 80 or over, and over half of those aged between 75 and 79, and 3/4 of elderly care home residents. And though it remains an exacting target, we are on track to achieve our goal of offering a first dose to everyone in the top 4 priority groups by the middle of February. I can also reassure the House that all current evidence shows that both the vaccines we are administering remain effective against the new variant that was first identified in London and the South East by means of our world-leading capability in genomic sequencing. The UK has now sequenced over half of all COVID-19 viral genomes that have been submitted to the global database, 10 times more than any other country. And yesterday, my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, announced our new variant assessment platform, through which we will work with the World Health Organization to offer our expertise to help other countries. Because a new variant anywhere poses a potential threat everywhere. To guard against this danger, we must also take additional steps to strengthen our borders to stop those strains from entering the UK. We've already temporarily closed all travel corridors, and we're already requiring anyone coming into this country to have proof of a negative COVID test taken in the 72 hours before leaving. They must also complete a passenger locator form, which must be checked before they board and then quarantine on arrival for 10 days. I want to make clear that under the stay-at-home regulations, it is illegal to leave home to travel abroad for leisure purposes. And we will enforce this at ports, at airports, by asking people why they are leaving and instructing them to return home if they do not have a valid reason to travel. We have also banned all travel from 22 countries where there is a risk of known variants, including South Africa, Portugal, and South American nations. And in order to reduce the risk posed by UK nationals and residents returning home from these countries, I can announce that we will require all such arrivals who cannot be refused entry to isolate in government-provided accommodation, such as hotels, for 10 days without exception. They will be met at the airport and transported directly into quarantine. The Department for Health and Social Care is working to establish these facilities as quickly as possible. And my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will set out the details of our plans in her statement shortly. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, has this morning spoken to the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales and the First and Deputy First Ministers of Northern Ireland. And as we have throughout this pandemic, we will be working closely with the DAs to implement these new measures so that where possible, we continue with a UK-wide approach. Mr. Speaker, it was the emergence of a new variant, up to 70% more transmissible, that forced England back into lockdown, and I know everyone yearns to know how much longer we must endure these restrictions, with all their consequences for jobs, livelihoods, and, most tragically of all, the life chances of our children. We will not persist for a day longer than is necessary, but nor can we relax too soon. Because if we do, we run the risk of our NHS coming under still greater pressure, compelling us to reimpose every restriction and sustain those restrictions for longer. So far, our efforts do appear to have reduced the R rate, but we do not yet have enough data to know exactly how soon it will be safe to reopen our society and economy. At this point, we don't have enough data to judge the full effect of vaccines in blocking transmission, nor the extent and speed with which the vaccines will reduce hospitalizations and deaths, nor how quickly the combination of vaccinations and the lockdown can be expected to ease the pressure on the NHS. What we do know is that we remain in a perilous situation, with more than 37,000 patients now in hospital with COVID, almost double the peak of the first wave. But the overall picture should be clearer by mid-February. By then, we will know much more about the effect of vaccines in preventing hospitalizations and deaths, using data from the UK, but also other nations like Israel. We will know how successful the current restrictions have been in driving down infections. We will also know how many people are still in hospital with COVID, which we simply can't predict with certainty today. So we will then be in a better position to chart a course out of lockdown without risking a further surge that would overwhelm the NHS. When I announced the lockdown, I said we would review its measures in mid-February once the most vulnerable had been offered the first dose of the vaccine. So I can tell the House that when Parliament returns from recess in the week commencing the 22nd of February, subject to the full agreement of the House, Mr. Speaker, we intend to set out the results of that review and publish our plan for taking the country out of lockdown. That plan will, of course, depend on the continued success of our vaccination programme, the capacity of the NHS, and on deaths falling at the pace we would expect as more people are inoculated. Our aim will be to set out a gradual and phased approach towards easing the restrictions in a sustainable way, guided by the principles we've observed throughout the pandemic, beginning with the most important principle of all, that reopening schools must be our national priority. And the first sign of normality beginning to return should be pupils going back to their classrooms. I know how parents and teachers need as much certainty as possible, including 2 weeks' notice of the return of face-to-face teaching. So I must inform the House that for the reasons I have outlined, it will not be possible to reopen schools immediately after the February half-term. And I know how frustrating that will be and will be for pupils and teachers who want nothing more than to get back to the classroom, and for parents and for carers who've spent so many months juggling their day jobs, not only with homeschooling, but with meeting the myriad other demands of their children from breakfast until bedtime. And I know too the worries we all share about the mental health of our young people during this prolonged period of being stuck at home. So our plan for leaving the lockdown will set out our approach towards reopening schools. If we achieve our target of vaccinating everyone in the four most vulnerable groups with their first dose by the 15th of February, and every passing day sees more progress towards that goal, then those groups that have developed immunity from the virus about 3 weeks later, that is by the 8th of March. We hope it will therefore be safe to begin the reopening of schools from Monday the 8th of March, with other economic and social restrictions being removed thereafter as and when the data permits. Then or thereafter, I should say, Mr. Speaker. As we're extending the period of remote learning beyond the middle of February, I can confirm that the government will prolong arrangements for providing free school meals for those eligible children not in school, including food parcels and the national voucher scheme, until they've returned to the classroom. We can also commit now that as we did this financial year, we will provide a programme of catch-up over the next financial year. And this will involve a further £300 million of new money to schools for tutoring. And we will work in collaboration with the education sector to develop, as appropriate, specific initiatives for summer schools and a COVID premium to support catch-up. But we recognise that these extended school closures have had a huge impact on children's learning, which will take more than a year to make up. So we will work with parents, teachers and schools to develop a long-term plan to make sure pupils have the chance to make up their learning over the course of this Parliament. I know, Mr. Speaker, that the measures I'm setting out today will be deeply frustrating to many honourable friends and colleagues and disappointing for all of us. But the way forward has been clear ever since the vaccines arrived. And as we inoculate more people hour by hour, this is the time to hold our nerve in the end game of the battle against the virus. And our goal now must be to buy the extra weeks we need to immunise the most vulnerable and get this virus under control so that together we can defeat this most wretched disease, reclaim our lives once and for all. And Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
I'm now going to call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer, who is participating virtually. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement. Mr. Speaker, to lose 100,000 people to this virus is nothing short of a national tragedy. It is a stark number. An empty chair at the kitchen table. A person obviously taken before their time. And today, we should remember that. And we should mark the moment by learning the lessons of the last year to make sure that the same mistakes are not made again. Of course, any government would have struggled with this pandemic. I get that. The British people get that. But the reality is that Britain is the first country in Europe to suffer 100,000 deaths. And we have one of the highest death rates in the world. And the Prime Minister often says that he's been balancing the health restrictions against economic risks. But that simply doesn't wash, because alongside that high death toll, we also have the deepest recession of any major economy, the lowest growth of any major economy, and we're on course to have one of the slowest recoveries of any major economy. So for all the contrition and sympathy that the Prime Minister expresses, and I recognise how heartfelt that is, the truth is this was not inevitable. It wasn't just bad luck. It's the result of a huge number of mistakes by the Prime Minister during the course of this pandemic. We were too slow into lockdown last March, too slow to get protective equipment to the front line, and of course too slow to protect our care homes. Mr. Speaker, 20% of deaths in this pandemic have come from care home residents, 20%. And I really don't think that the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary understand just how offensive it was to pretend that there was a protective ring around our care homes. The government had the chance over the summer to learn from those mistakes in the first wave and prepare for a second wave and a challenging winter. I put that challenge to the Prime Minister in June, but that chance was wasted. The government then went on to fail to deliver an effective test, trace and isolate system, despite all of the warnings. They failed to deliver clear and reliable public messaging, crucial in a pandemic. 1 minute telling people to go to work, then to do the complete opposite. And the Prime Minister has failed on a number of occasions to follow the scientific advice that the virus was getting out of control. First in September, when that advice was given, and the failure to implement a circuit break or lockdown over half term as we suggested. Then in December, with the fiasco over Christmas mixing, And once again, in the 13-day delay from December 22nd, when that further medical advice was given and the third national lockdown was finally introduced. As a result, we've seen a third wave more deadly than the first and second waves. Mr. Speaker, 50,000 people have died since November the 11th. 50,000 deaths in 77 days. That's a scarcely believable toll on the British people. Now, in isolation, any of these mistakes are perhaps understandable. Taken together, it's a damning indictment of how the government has handled this pandemic. The Prime Minister says, well, now is not the time to answer the question why. That's the answer he gave back in the summer after the first wave, that then was not the time to answer why. He said the same after the second wave. And he says it again now, each time repeating the mistakes over and over again. That's why now is the time to ask and answer the question why. The way out of this nightmare has now been provided by our amazing scientists, our NHS, our armed forces, and hundreds of thousands of volunteers. The vaccine programme is making incredible progress. The British people have come together to deliver what is the largest peacetime effort in our history. And despite the Prime Minister's constant complaining, all of us are doing whatever we can to help that vaccine roll out as swiftly and as safely as possible. On schools, first I have to say, even for this Prime Minister, it's quite something to open schools one day, close them the next, to call them vectors of transmission, and then to challenge me to say that the schools he's closed are safe. Only now to give a statement where he says that schools can't open until the 8th of March at the earliest because it's not safe to do so. That's his analysis. It's the sort of nonsense that's led us to the highest death toll in Europe and the worst recession. But of course we welcome any steps forward in reopening schools. And we're going to look at the detail of how the Education Secretary plans to deliver this and the plans to deliver online learning. And I also hope the Prime Minister will take seriously our proposal, echoed incidentally by the Children's Commissioner and the Conservative Chair of the Education Select Committee, that once the first 4 categories of the most vulnerable have been vaccinated by mid-February, he should bring forward the vaccination of key workers and use that window of the February half term to vaccinate all school staff, including every teacher and teaching assistant. There's a clear week there when that could be done, and it should be done. On borders, we'll look at the detail.
Order. I've got to say, I hope the Right Honourable Gentleman who's coming to the end is well past the 5 minutes that's allocated.
Mr. Speaker, on borders, Mr. Speaker, we'll look at the Prime Minister's statement in detail and obviously hear what the Home Secretary has to say. But, Mr. Speaker, in due course, there will be a public inquiry and the Prime Minister will have to answer question. But I hope that he can finally answer this very simple and direct question. Because yesterday the Prime Minister was maintaining the government had done, his words, everything we could to save lives. So is he really saying to those grieving families that their loss was just inevitable and that none of the 100,000 deaths could have been avoided? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Terrible misjudgment.
Mr. Speaker, if the Right Honourable Gentleman asks about mistakes, and I've said there will be a time to reflect and to analyse, to learn lessons and to prepare. But I may say to him that I believe the biggest mistake that he has made is in seeking continually to attack what the government has been trying to do at every opportunity, supporting one week and then attacking the very same policy the next week. And he complains about confusion of messages, Mr. Speaker. How much has he actually done as leader of the opposition to reassure the public, for instance, about NHS test and trace, which has done a very good job, I notice, of confining him for the third time? What has he done to reassure people about messaging rather than attacking confusion and trying to sow doubt about what the government is doing? I think there was a very different path open to him at the beginning of this pandemic, and I think it's a great pity that he hasn't taken it. If I may say so, on schools, Mr. Speaker, he knows perfectly well that the problem is not that schools are unsafe. They are not unsafe. Schools are safe, and he should say it, and his union paymasters should hear him say it loud and clear. The problem is that, Mr. Speaker, that they bring communities together. Obviously, large numbers of kids are a considerable vector of transmission. It's not that there's any particular extra risk, Mr. Speaker, to those involved in education. And I heard with interest what he had to say about his proposal for changing the JCVI priority list. And I really think that the Right Honourable Gentleman should reflect on what he is saying. Because the JCVI priority list, 1 to 9, is designed by experts, by clinicians, to prioritise, Mr. Speaker, those groups who are most likely to die or to suffer from coronavirus. And by trying to change that, and saying that he wants now to bring in other groups of public sector workers to be decided by politicians rather than by the JCVI, he has to explain which vaccines he would take from which vulnerable groups, Mr. Speaker, to make sense of his policy, because that is what he is doing. And that is what the Labour proposal would involve. And indeed, by making it more difficult for us to vaccinate all those vulnerable groups in the fastest possible way, Mr. Speaker, that policy, that Labour policy, would actually delay our route out of lockdown, delay our ability to get kids back into school in the way that they want. So I urge him to think again, or at least to explain which members of those vulnerable groups would be deprived of vaccines in order to follow the Labour policy. And all I can say, Mr. Speaker, having listened carefully to what the Honourable Gentleman had to say, is that everybody will have to answer questions at the end of this, and I think all politicians, let me put it this way, all politicians will be asked what they did, what we did, collaboratively, working together for the people of our country to beat this virus. And I'm not sure that upon reflection, the Right Honourable Gentleman's choice was the right one for either for his party or the country.
Let's head to Surrey, to the Chair of the Select Committee, Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, Baroness Harding said that 40% of the people asked to self-isolate by NHS test and trace weren't fully doing so, which works out at a worrying 30,000 people every single day who are potentially still spreading the virus, many of them still going to work. Because this is such a big threat to our containment strategy for the virus, I wonder if the Prime Minister could say what he thinks we need to do to deal with this, and in particular, whether it is now time to consider making a blanket offer to those asked to self-isolate that we will make good any salary they lose, because in the end that may be cheaper than having to extend furlough if the case rate remains high.
Prime Minister.
I very much respect my right honourable friend's suggestion, and I understand the logic of what he is saying, but I believe that the people of this country should be self-isolating in the way that the Right Honourable General Leader of the Opposition is rightly doing, on the basis that it's the right thing for themselves, for their families and for the country. They do get support where needed of £500, and there are very considerable fines for failing to do it. And I think that is the right way forward, and I hope he will join me in commending prompt action by everybody who is asked to self-isolate. It's the right thing to do for you, for your family and for the country.
Let's head up to Scotland, to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank the Prime Minister for an advanced copy of his statement. Mr. Speaker, as we know, yesterday the UK reached yet another terrible milestone, 100,000 COVID-related deaths. today it is only right that we reflect on all of those who have lost their lives during this pandemic. And our thoughts and prayers are most especially with their families, those who are left with the heaviest burden of grief. In time, there will be a reckoning on the UK government's response to this virus. And it's clear that that verdict may well be damning. In the here and now, though, it remains our job to focus on how we can support and save as many people as possible in the weeks and months ahead. That means a renewed commitment to maintaining public health, but it also must mean a renewed package of financial support for all of those Prime Ministers who've been left behind by this Tory government. Right now, COVID is the immediate threat to life, but poverty remains a killer too. In 2019, the IPPR revealed that Tory austerity cuts over the previous decade had resulted in as many as 130,000 preventable deaths. The Prime Minister promised not to repeat Tory austerity. If people are to believe him, then he should start by making three important announcements today. Extend the furlough scheme for the full duration of the pandemic, maintain the uplift to universal credit and apply it to legacy benefits, and put in place a package of support for the 3 million included. Prime Minister, 11th hour announcements have got to stop. These decisions can't wait until the budget in March. People need certainty now. I asked the Prime Minister these same questions at Prime Minister's Questions, but failed to get a straight answer. So please try again, Prime Minister. Will his government extend furlough, maintain the universal credit uplift and offer support for the 3 million excluded? And finally, Mr. Speaker, on international travel. Both the Scottish and Welsh governments want to go further on quarantining measures than what his UK government is proposing. Will the Prime Minister stop his half measures and enjoin the governments in Scotland and Wales in stricter enforcements on international travel? That, Prime Minister, would be leadership.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to what the devolved administrations do later, but I can tell the House that we're putting in the toughest measures of virtually anywhere in the world, and my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will be setting out the detail in due course. And I can tell him that this country, through the might of the UK Treasury, as my right honourable friend the Chancellor has said many times, has been able to look after people across the UK. It's thanks to the UK government that we have the furlough scheme, the bounce back loans, the many other forms of support, and it's thanks to the UK that we have, for instance, the Army able to move people in distress with COVID in remote parts of Scotland to the hospitals where they need to get to, and indeed the British Army helping across Scotland, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say, to distribute the vaccines that are so essential for our fight back from this virus. So I hope that he will abandon his nationalist position, narrow nationalist position, and look at the achievements of the UK overall. And I think it is a fine thing. It'd be a wonderful thing, by the way, if the Scottish Nationalist Party for a moment would stop talking about their desire for a referendum, Mr. Speaker, while we are trying to deal with a pandemic.
David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister is very properly concerned to protect our National Health Service, and particularly to prevent hospitals and intensive care units being overwhelmed this winter. My question is about the scope to enhance primary care to reduce the need for COVID patients to go to hospital in the first place. New Canadian studies published this week, 4,500 people, show the use of colchicine has cut hospital admissions by 25% and death rates by almost half. Similarly, ivermectin studies, some of them have shown 75% reductions in death rates. What scope is there to act quickly to enhance our primary care level to protect populations and hospitals this winter? This winter, not next winter.
Yeah. I can tell my right honourable friend he makes a very important point, and that the Therapeutics Task Force is currently reviewing both the drugs that he mentions, and I'll make sure that he is kept up to speed with their findings.
Let's head to Sir Ed Davey. Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, as of 6:30 p.m. yesterday, the UK has the worst recorded death rate by head of population in the world. This is a grave moment for our country. I'm sure all our hearts go out to the families who have lost loved ones. Last week, the Prime Minister told me he was still not prepared to launch the inquiry into the COVID crisis that he promised 6 months ago. So instead today, will he at least tell the country that he will launch this inquiry sometime this year, so we can find out why our country has seen the worst death rates from COVID in the world, learn the lessons, and give bereaved families the answers and the justice he owes them.
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, once again, Madam Deputy Speaker, once again, the right honourable gentleman has the answer contained in his question, because this country is going through a very grievous bout of a deadly pandemic. He rightly draws attention to the death toll of 100,000, and as he knows, there are currently 37,000 people in hospital, and the entire British state is working flat out to bring that virus under control and to get us through this pandemic and out the other side. And now is, as I've told him before, not the right time to consecrate the energies and efforts of officialdom. It would be huge to an inquiry, though, as I have said before, I said last night, and I'll reassure him again today, yes, of course, there will be a time to learn lessons, to reflect, and to understand, and to prepare, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Now we go to Richard Drax.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome and thank my right honourable friend for his upbeat statement, which offers much needed hope to a beleaguered nation, rather contrary to Captain Hindsight's contribution. With a successful inoculation programme in full swing, his plan to break free from lockdowns and restrictions is critical. Variants or no variants, does my right honourable friend agree that the lives and livelihoods of millions of our citizens now depend on a more proportionate response to this pandemic, which will require political courage to initiate?
Mr. Speaker, I very much respect the point of view of my honourable friend, who has long been a keen and justified campaigner for liberty, and I share his instincts very strongly. But I must tell him that we will continue to be cautious in our approach, because we do not wish to see more lives lost than we can possibly avoid, Mr. Speaker. And so that's why what we will do is continue with the rollout of the vaccine programme, the fastest in Europe, and currently, and on February the 15th, as I just said to the House, we will look at where we are, and we will be setting out a roadmap, which I hope will be useful to him and to all colleagues throughout the House on February the 22nd.
And now we go to Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank the Prime Minister. Would the Prime Minister confirm what discussions have taken place with his counterparts in education to give ample time for teachers to either plan their online teaching with special reference to children who cannot or will not be able to access their online classes? I agree with the Prime Minister. I think it's better that the children are back in their classrooms. But can the Prime Minister ensure that all the teaching staff, especially the special needs teachers, will be a priority for the vaccine rollout? And can he also confirm that there will be no shortage of vaccine, as was indicated on the press today? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, forgive me. We're rolling out 1.3 million laptops. We're making sure that pupils have access to online learning wherever possible. But the most important thing is, as the right honourable gentleman has rightly said, is get kids back in school as soon as we sensibly can. That's what this government is determined to do. I want to reassure him about the vaccination programme. He mentioned anxieties about supply. As I stand before you today, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am confident that we'll deliver on the February the 15th pledge, and that we'll continue to be able to drive up. I see my honourable friend, who the Minister for the vaccine rollout, confirming that we will be able to continue that accelerating curve of supply as well.
Christian Wakefoot.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I join with members from across the House in sending my deepest of condolences to each and every one of the individuals who's tragically passed away as a result of COVID. However, during this extremely difficult time, I have nothing but admiration for the army of volunteers working tirelessly in my constituency and across the country. Will the Prime Minister join me in thanking organisations like the Fed, Jewish Volunteering Network, Heads Up and Porch Boxers, along with all those who've done so much to protect the vulnerable and the needy in Prestwich, Radcliffe and Whitefield?
Mr. Speaker, I will indeed join my honourable friend in paying tribute to those volunteers in his constituency. They join a huge constellation of shining points of light across our country. It's been one of the most extraordinary things. One of the consolations, one of the few consolations of this crisis has been the upsurge, Madam Deputy Speaker, there has been in volunteering.
Now we go to Debbie Abrams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I also associate my remarks with others and express my sincerest condolences to everyone who's lost a loved one, and particularly the constituents who I spoke with last night. Madam Deputy Speaker, Professor Sir Michael Marmot's recent report pointed to 4 drivers which have contributed to the high and unequal death toll in the UK. He identified the governance and political culture which has damaged social cohesion and inclusivity, the widening inequalities in power, money and resources, the regressive austerity policies over the last 10 years, and the declining life expectancy and healthy life expectancy of the poorest, particularly women, which is amongst the worst of all comparable economies. Professor Marmot has called for the government to address these issues and to build back fairer. So will the Prime Minister and his cabinet listen to him?
I have a very high regard, Madam Deputy Speaker, for Michael Marmot and worked closely with him for many years, and I believe his advice is invaluable, and we will indeed be making sure that as we come through this pandemic, we look at the way it has impacted on the poorest and the most vulnerable, and indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will build back fairer.
And now we go to James Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The vaccine rollout now offers hope and relief to vulnerable people who have spent months living in fear and in isolation. To hear that 6.8 million vaccines have now been delivered is an amazing achievement, and I thank everyone involved in this rollout. The mass vaccination hubs are an important part of the scheme, but many of my constituents with mobility issues are worried they're going to miss out on their vaccine because they can't make the journey to one of these larger hubs. Could the Prime Minister give them reassurance that they will be offered a vaccine locally or even in their own homes, and anyone unable to travel will be fully supported?
Prime Minister.
The Honourable Lady raises a very important point, and I hope she will give this reassurance to her constituents that they need to have no anxieties about that. They don't have to go to the vaccination centres. They can either go to their GP surgeries or indeed they will be visited in their own home.
Now we go to Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I add my condolences to those already expressed to the victims, their families and friends of this awful illness. One of the challenges children and adults working from home, the time now for children extended today by the Prime Minister, in addition to devices and connectivity, is the lack of digital skills. This week, I was made aware of an online scam asking people to put their financial information into a very plausible fake NHS website in order to get the vaccine. What is the Prime Minister doing to tackle this criminal activity, preying on often vulnerable people waiting for the vaccine? And also, what is the Prime Minister doing to ensure that individuals, young and old, have the digital skills they need to protect themselves, learn from home and work from home?
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right about the importance of digital skills and of connectivity, and that's why we're massively increasing, for instance, gigabit broadband across the country, superfast broadband, and making sure that people have the technology that they need. She raises a particularly important point about online scams, and these are a problem. And I can tell her that we're working across government to beat these fraudsters, to root them out, led by the Cabinet Office. And if she'd be kind enough to send me details of the case that she mentions, we will feed it into our system immediately.
And now we go to Greg Clark.
Hi.
Do we have the sound working for Mr. Clark?
What's going on? Hello, Greg.
Apologise to the